David Lawson, a respected judge in his community, was driving home after a long day at the courthouse. The quiet neighborhood of Clearbrook Hills where he lived was his sanctuary. It was a place of peace, far from the demands of his high-pressure job. His newly acquired Mercedes-Benz was a symbol of his years of dedication and hard work, a small reward for all his efforts. As David drove down the smooth, tree-lined streets, the last rays of the setting sun bathed the area in a golden light, giving everything a calm and serene aura. He enjoyed this time of day, when he could reflect on his cases and let his mind wander to simpler, happier thoughts. His favorite jazz music played softly on the radio, blending seamlessly with the gentle evening breeze. But his tranquility was suddenly disrupted by the flashing red and blue lights of a police car behind him, followed by the sharp sound of a siren. David's brow furrowed in confusion as he wondered what could have caused the stop. He knew he hadn't been speeding, and his car's documents were all in order. He remained calm and carefully pulled over to the side of the road. The police car stopped right behind him. A tall officer, wearing a stern expression, stepped out. Her badge read Sophia Clark, and her purposeful strides were confident as she approached David's window. David rolled it down, keeping his hands firmly on the steering wheel, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the sudden tension in the air. "License and registration," Officer Clark ordered sharply, her tone cold and impersonal. David was taken aback by her abruptness, but handed over his documents. He responded in a calm voice, "Officer, I am Judge David Lawson. I live in this neighborhood. Can you tell me what the issue is?" Officer Clark barely glanced at the documents before stepping back. Her demeanor remained rigid, and her eyes held a sharpness that seemed to scrutinize David rather than his paperwork. "Step out of the vehicle, Mr. Lawson," she demanded. David blinked in surprise, his calm fading slightly. "I don't understand, officer. What have I done wrong?" "Step out of the vehicle now," she repeated, her hand hovering near her holster, a silent warning of authority. David felt his heart rate pick up, but he reminded himself to stay composed. He was a judge, and he knew how to handle stressful situations. Yet in this moment, something felt off. Slowly, David opened the door and stepped out of the car, the street lights casting long shadows over him as the tension in the air thickened. His hands were steady, but his mind raced. He couldn't help but feel the weight of what seemed to be a racial profiling situation. Officer Clark's gaze was unwavering, and her body language suggested she saw him not as a judge, but as a suspect. As David stood beside his car, another police car arrived, its headlights bright in the darkening evening. Officer Michael Davis stepped out, his expression hard and unreadable. He joined Officer Clark, and the two exchanged a few words in hushed tones before Clark turned to David again. "This vehicle matches the description of a stolen car," she said flatly. David's eyes widened in disbelief. "This is my car," he stated firmly, his voice steady despite the rising anger inside him. "I bought it recently and all the paperwork is in order. You can verify everything." Officer Clark ignored his words, turning to Officer Davis. "Search the vehicle," she ordered, her voice sharp and dismissive. David's chest tightened with indignation, but he held his ground. "You don't need to search my car. A simple check of the registration will clear this up." "It's for safety," Officer Clark responded with a hint of sarcasm. "Do as I said." The officers began searching the car, and soon the neighbors started peeking out of their windows, some even pulling out their phones to record. David could feel the public humiliation, his every move being watched and judged. Inside the trunk, Officer Davis found a black duffel bag. He unzipped it, revealing several sealed packets, along with a receipt dated that very day. David's heart sank as he stared at the bag, his mind racing. "I've never seen that bag before," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's not mine. Someone must have planted it." Officer Clark smirked, her skepticism clear. "A likely story," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Cuff him," she ordered. The cold metal of the handcuffs clamped around David's wrists, and despite his anger, he stood tall. He refused to let this injustice break him. The flashing lights of the patrol cars created an eerie glow around him as the neighbors watched from their windows, some recording the scene. "Do you realize what you're doing?" David said, his voice sharp and commanding. "You're destroying the reputation of an innocent man. This will not end here." His words carried weight, and for a moment, Clark's confidence wavered. She quickly masked it, her stern expression returning. "This isn't personal, Mr. Lawson. We're just doing our job." David let out a bitter laugh. "Your job?" he asked. "This isn't law enforcement. This is prejudice masquerading as duty. You'll regret this." The words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed like the tension would reach a breaking point. Just then, another car arrived. A tall figure stepped out. It was Captain Thomas Reed, a man with years of experience in law enforcement. He immediately recognized David and approached with a commanding presence. "What's going on here?" Captain Reed asked, his voice firm but calm. "Captain, this man is a judge," Officer Clark began, but Reed held up a hand, silencing her. His eyes were fixed on David as he spoke. "David Lawson," Reed said, his tone softer now. "I know who you are. Please tell me what's happening." David took a deep breath, feeling a small sense of relief at the captain's arrival. "Captain, I've been falsely accused. They're claiming my car is stolen, but I've owned it for weeks. Everything is in order. I've shown them the paperwork, but they're not listening." Reed turned to Officer Clark, his gaze unwavering. "Did you verify his information?" he asked. Clark hesitated, then admitted, "No, Captain, but the car matches the description." "Enough!" Captain Reed interrupted, his tone firm. He turned to Officer Davis. "Remove the cuffs." Officer Davis quickly complied, releasing the handcuffs from David's wrists. David rubbed his sore wrists, his mind still processing the gravity of the situation. Captain Reed turned back to David, his voice now calm and apologetic. "David Lawson, I sincerely apologize for this incident. This should never have happened, and I will make sure it's addressed personally." The tension in the air seemed to dissipate slightly as David met Reed's eyes. "I appreciate your apology, Captain, but the damage has already been done." David's voice was steady but tinged with frustration. "This isn't just about me. This is about the bigger issue of racial profiling that still plagues our communities." Reed nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of David's words. "I understand, and I will make sure this is used as a lesson for the entire department. This kind of behavior won't be tolerated." News of the incident quickly spread, and the footage recorded by the neighbors went viral, sparking outrage across the city. People were shocked by what had happened, and many came forward to show support for David. David used his newfound platform to speak out about the injustice he faced and the larger issue of systemic bias in law enforcement. He organized community meetings where he shared his experience and advocated for change. One evening, Officer Clark stood before the community, her demeanor humbled. "I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice quiet but sincere. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry. I am committed to learning from this and ensuring it never happens again." David stood beside her, showing a willingness to work toward reconciliation. He spoke to the crowd, his voice strong. "This isn't about me," he said. "It's about creating a system that serves everyone equally, regardless of their race or background." The community's response was overwhelming. People shared their own stories of racial profiling and discrimination, sparking a movement for change. As the community came together, David's advocacy began to show tangible results. Local organizations, inspired by his actions, worked with the police department to create forums where community members could share their experiences with law enforcement. These forums became a place for people to speak out about their encounters with police, especially those who had faced racial profiling. David listened intently to every story, his heart heavy with the familiar pain he had experienced. One young man, Jamal, shared his experience of being stopped and harassed repeatedly while walking home from school. "Every time I leave the house, I wonder if I'm going to get stopped," Jamal said, his voice trembling with frustration. David nodded, his expression solemn. "Your voice matters," he said. "Together, we can demand accountability and change." His words resonated with the crowd, and they left the meeting with a renewed sense of purpose. The forums led to actionable outcomes. The police department implemented new training programs focused on implicit bias and community engagement. Officers were now required to attend regular workshops designed to build trust with the communities they served. David's story became a case study nationwide. Law enforcement officials across the country acknowledged the need for systemic reform, using his story as an example of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. David testified before local and state government committees, advocating for legislative changes to address racial bias in policing. His calm and authoritative demeanor made him a powerful voice for justice. Bias is not just an individual failing, he told lawmakers. It's a systemic issue that requires systemic solutions. His words sparked discussions about the need for sweeping changes in how law enforcement interacts with marginalized communities. Despite his public advocacy, David found moments of quiet reflection, often late at night when the world had settled down. He would sit at his desk, reviewing the countless letters and emails of support he had received. Each message was a reminder of the impact his story had on others. At times, David confided in close friends about the humiliation he had felt during the incident. He spoke of the anger that simmered just beneath the surface, the frustration of being treated as less than human by those who were supposed to protect him. "It's not easy to move past something like this," he admitted quietly, "but I'm determined to channel that anger into something constructive." His resolve to continue his fight for justice only grew stronger with each passing day. Months later, David received an invitation to speak at a national conference on criminal justice reform. His keynote address focused on the importance of empathy and accountability in law enforcement. "Justice isn't just about laws and courts," David said in his speech. "It's about how we treat each other in our daily lives." The audience responded with a standing ovation, recognizing David's unwavering commitment to justice. The impact of his words was profound, and David realized that his personal struggle had transformed into a nationwide movement for change. He had become a symbol of resilience and hope, not just for himself, but for countless others. As David continued his work, he began to notice tangible changes in his own community of Pine Brook. The police department's relationship with residents had improved, and officers were now attending community events more regularly. One afternoon, as David was walking through the neighborhood, a young boy approached him. "Are you Mr. Lawson?" the boy asked shyly. When David nodded, the boy smiled. "Thank you for making things better," he said, his voice full of gratitude. David smiled back, his heart warmed by the boy's words. "It's a team effort," he replied, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The small victory was a reminder that change, though slow, was still possible. David knew that his journey was far from over, but he remained committed to ensuring that the progress he had fought for would continue.